In a world of people, I stand alone. PTSD and autism up close. Hollowness inside me sometimes fills me with rage, then sorrow, then shame, and then back to being hollow. Hurts. To hug feels as if knives are stabbing me all over. To laugh takes all of my breath. People around me don't understand, so I stand alone. It is cold and dark where I stand underneath the tree. People don't see my day. I stand alone. I don't look sick, so no one knows. My head is pounding, my arms are aching, my heart is racing, or that my hands are shaking. I cannot explain. I shouldn't have to explain. I don't want to explain. So here I stand, alone. Post-traumatic stress disorder. What scary words they are. They are often words full of fear, anger, hatred, sorrow, isolation, judgment, and resentment. I'm one of over 44 million people who struggle with PTSD. That is a fact that will never change about me. It doesn't mean I am weak or that I have given up. I have instead chosen to stand up and fight. I found the strength and courage to pick up my broken pieces, repair my wounded spirit. Too many people have died facing the battle with PTSD. Until we quit hiding, turning our heads, and whispering in shame, things will not change. We need support and understanding, validation. We may experience sadness and unworthiness that led to isolation protective measures. Judith Herman discussed the state of chronic humiliation, of feeling unaccepted, how shame can be a physiologically stressful experience, and the role of shame in the development of traumatic disorders. People need to be more careful how they treat us Aspies. They claim to love us, but then they constantly remind us how much of a failure we are. When we try so hard to do it right, we are just wired that way. We feel we are aliens, never ever fitting in. So we try to find solutions. The leading cause of death for autistics. We heard too many times how much of a failure we are, and we just can't take it anymore. And we start believing things don't ever get better. The battle seems just bigger than us, overwhelming. We are at the end of our rope. We don't need that. We need people that are in our camp, that celebrate our neurodiversity, instead of mocking, shaming, belittling, demeaning, bullying, or criticizing us. It is our behavior, communication, and quality of presence that brings the most poignant stigma. We are judged, dismissed, marginalized, rejected, and stereotyped because our actions do not conform to conventional standards, and our social value is diminished accordingly. Trauma can make the challenge of being autistic worse and cause great emotional suffering, yet it may be the most neglected variable of all. Gordon Gates. Not only does it often result in perfunctory oversimplified solutions, it neglects the most important thing. The client's perspective is not explored. They do not leave feeling understood or validated. In cases involving autism, the person's experience of stigma and the resulting invalidation is often a major component of why they are there, to not receive the validation of being listened to, not given the opportunity to get at the underlying perspective. The autistic person may leave feeling no further ahead. In fact, the professional they were dealing with may have added to their trauma. And this is how it looks like when you are in a stress response. You are either stuck on or stuck on off. You are either in a fight or flight or in a freeze response. So, feeling angry, having rage, or feeling sad not necessarily belongs to autism. It's PTSD. Being autistic can sometimes mean enduring a litany of traumatic events, starting from a young age. And for many, those events may add up to severe and persistent post-traumatic stress disorder. Like other psychiatric conditions, PTSD simply looks different in people with autism than it does in the general population. It seems possible to me that it's not that PTSD is less common, but potentially that we're not measuring it well. Or that the way traumatic stress expresses itself in people on the spectrum is different. It seemed we were ignoring a huge part of the picture. The more they dig in, the more these researchers are finding that many autistic people might have some form of PTSD. We're all just trying to put together the pieces and recognize that it's an important area that requires further study. It's been a call to arms for the field to start looking at this. These researchers have their work cut out for them. In the typical population, PTSD is fairly well defined. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5, Psychiatry's Guide to Diagnosis, PTSD usually develops after someone sees or experiences a terrifying or life-threatening event. After that initial episode, any reminder of it can trigger panic, extreme startle reflexes, and flashbacks. Beyond that, however, there's a wide variety in the way PTSD manifests. It can lead to hypervigilance and anger. It can cause recurring nightmares and other sleep issues, or it can lead to depression, persistent fear, aggression, irritability, or difficulty concentrating and remembering things. If you do the math, according to the PTSD criteria in the DSM-5, you can have 636,000 different combinations of symptoms that describe PTSD, says Danny Hirsch, head of the Trauma and Stress Research Lab at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Given all the traits in people with autism that may overlay these permutations, you have a lot of reason to think that their version of PTSD might be very different. Preliminary studies are just beginning to confirm that idea and to show that what constitutes trauma may be different in people on the spectrum. Together with Ofer Golan, an autism expert at Bar Ilan, and others, Hirsch has begun investigating where PTSD and autism converge. We know from the literature that individuals with autism are much more exposed to bullying, ostracizing, teasing, etc. Golan says, and when you look in the clinic, you can see that they're very sensitive to these kinds of events. Among autistic students, Golan and Hirsch have found social incidents such as ostracizing predict PTSD more strongly than violent ones, such as war, terror, or abuse, which are not uncommon in Israel. Among typical students, though, the researchers see the opposite tendency. Given the differences and the communication challenges autistic people often have, their PTSD can be particularly difficult to recognize and resolve. It's so absurd that there are such excellent treatments for autism today and such excellent treatments for PTSD today, and so much research on these interventions, but no one to date has connected both, Hirsch says. How do you treat PTSD in autistics? No one really knows. Well, start to validate their way of doing things. Characterizing the convergence. It can be difficult to treat autism and PTSD separately in people who have both conditions, because the boundaries between the two are often so blurry. And that may ironically be the key treating them. In other conditions that overlap with PTSD as well as those that overlap with autism, researchers have found that it is most effective to develop therapies when they look at both conditions simultaneously. The researchers are uncovering some important overlaps between autism and PTSD in their studies. In a group of 103 college students, for instance, they found that students who have more autistic traits also have more signs of PTSD, such as avoiding sources of trauma and negative changes in mood. The highest risk group of one was also the highest risk group in the other. People with more autistic traits display a specific form of PTSD, one characterized by hyperarousal. They may be more easily startled, more likely to have insomnia, predisposed to anger and anxiety. There you have it. Or have greater difficulty concentrating than is seen in other forms of PTSD. Recognizing this subtype could be particularly helpful for spotting and preventing it, and for developing treatments, Herr says, especially because the same traits might otherwise be mistakenly attributed to autism and overlooked. We know that each PTSD has a different color, a different presence in the clinic, he said. In speaking with participants about causes of trauma, she has heard everything from sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and horrendous bullying to much broader concepts, like what it's like to go around your whole life in a world where you have 50% less input than everyone else because you have social deficits, or feeling constantly overwhelmed by sensory experience, feeling marginalized in our society because you're somebody with differences. In other words, she says, the experience of having autism and the trauma associated with that. One parent Kern spoke with had moved to a shelter with her autistic son to escape intense domestic violence. Her son had witnessed the abuse but seemed more affected by the move, the change in his routine, and sudden loss of the family pet, which had to be left behind, than by the violence. He began to hurt himself more than he had before, and to ask repeatedly for the pet. Yeah, because autistics, they connect to animals way stronger. Kern says, 3 years later he was still asking for the pet, because the pet was one of the few relationships and connections with another being that he had. Yeah, and that's a real trauma. From my own experience, I can also say that I'm still sad about how it went down when I was 12 and we adopted a dog in Spain during that vacation. And of course, I wanted to keep him. That's just natural. And I begged my parents to keep him. And my parents both had dogs when they were little, so they knew how to take care of a dog, right? But we had to leave that dog behind, and I had already bonded to this dog. I really loved him. I wanted to keep him, and I cried my eyes out when we drove back to Switzerland and had to leave the dog behind. That's just one of the traumas I still remember and still feel sad about. 1986 was a very difficult year for me. In summer, my dad had forced me to attend a summer camp with other Czech teenagers, and you know how teenagers are, and there were so many people in that place. It was a summer camp, so much fucking noise, and I felt so lonely. And I got sick, and then I just stayed in the hotel room for the remainder of the summer camp. It was 2 weeks, but I just stayed in the room because solitude for me was more comfortable than feeling alone in a crowd of screaming fucking teenagers. So that was a trauma in itself, and I never wanted to go there. So then, when we went to Spain in autumn 1986, I totally bonded to this dog. We found him at the beach and we just looked after him. And he was such a sweet dog. And he slept next to me during those 14 days. I just totally bonded to him. Such a sweet dog. Very playful, very sweet. He never barked. Yeah. And I am still sad that I could not take him home. Have him as an animal companion. In another instance, a 12-year-old boy she interviewed refused to go to school and was hospitalized for threatening self-harm. The root of his trauma turned out to be ear-piercing fire drills. For a 53-year-old woman she talked to, crippling traumatic stress resulted from the paperwork she needs to fill out every year to qualify for housing and other types of assistance. How PTSD manifests in autistic people can also be unexpected and can exacerbate autistic traits such as regression of skills or communication, as well as stereotype behaviors of speech. Based on these observations, Kearns and her collaborators plan to create autism-specific trauma assessment to test on a larger scale. Again, the way traumatic stress expresses itself in people on the spectrum may be different. This line of research is still in its earlier days. It is still difficult to tease apart correlation from causation. In other words, does autism predispose someone to post-traumatic stress, or are people with autism more vulnerable to experiencing traumatic events, or both? I think it's probably both. As long as you are not in an autism-friendly environment, you will experience stress. However, on top of that, if people then make fun of you, invalidate your experience, that's trauma. Invalidation trauma. Some studies do indicate that autistic children are more reactive to stressful events, and because they lack the coping skills that help them calm down, perhaps predisposed to PTSD.